Ah, fuck. I can't figure it out. And apparently I can't post information. So I was sitting and watching a YouTube video, and there was this fascinating video that I saw pop up on my recommended stuff, which is probably because I've watched a number of his videos in the past. And basically he talks about working out and sort of the dynamics of working out and how to get stronger and build your muscles. And so the whole idea is sort of the CrossFit premise, which is to say that, hey, these natural movements that we have allow us to get stronger and execute on strength in a more practical sort of outcome than lifting weights, because lifting weights is sort of static position and static pull. And so he had this video that I found super interesting, because he talks about it, and basically like he shows his fancy push-up, and he does this push-up where he balances like solely on his arms, lifts his legs up, his body up. And so he's got this really great core strength, and he does his push-up just on arms, which is fucking impressive to begin with. But what I found super interesting is his dialogue related to how he got there. And so you'll notice in the video what he talks about is the leverage, or the class of, he's talking about a class of lever if you're talking about classical mathematics, in that when you're doing a regular push-up, your arms are straight out, and about 70% of your body weight is on your arms, which means your legs are handling 30%, your upper body is handling 70%. And that's what's known as a third class lever, which means that the mass or the weight is actually closer to the fulcrum, or that point that's actually touching the ground. A lot of people joining. Wow. The weight is actually closer to the fulcrum, or your legs on the ground, than it is to the point where you're applying pressure, which is the lift from your arms. And so what he talks about in the video is actually taking and changing this place that you're applying leverage. And so he's moving the hands lower to the body, lower in the center of gravity, but he's also changing the function of the lever, right? And so there's this really critical spot where the center of mass actually gravitates towards your upper body. So when your arms come down, you're changing the leverage. So now you have a balanced weight in your upper body and your lower body. So mathematically, you've changed the function, okay? So your lever now went from most of the weight down here and your point of pressure up here to almost balanced, and you've got more weight towards the top end than the bottom, which is a fascinating function of a lever. You move from I believe it's a third class lever that functions like this, such as a wheelbarrow. And yeah, Bob Ross in the background. I was going to talk about the musicality of Bob Ross and how he may be my favorite musician, even though he just talks, but I'll save that for a different time. And so from a mathematic perspective, you have a third class lever where the weight is all down here. You move that here, and so it's balanced between the two, and now that's a second class lever, okay? And what he basically does is he takes and he picks that bottom up. And so once you remove this as a point, you're changing the leverage again, and instead your single point of emphasis is here. And so he's showing very physically how physics works, and changing that spectrum of a lever from being third class, second class, and then no class. It's not even a lever at that point. It's just leverage, or it's strength that's pushing him up. And so it's just a sort of a very beautiful view of, one, how physics works in sort of a natural thing, and how math as a construct, like I like to say I hate math, but it's not I hate math. I just hate trying to understand the depth of it, because it's a lot of cognitive emphasis that goes into trying to break down how math works. But what he's showing is basically math and physics in motion, and it's sort of this really beautiful orchestration of how that works. And so I copied the link, and I don't know how Facebook Live works. I'm not gonna lie, I was trying to do YouTube and then post it over to Facebook, and so fuck it, whatever. But for me, it was very cool to see it in motion, and I don't think the guy even knows that he's talking about math and sort of that leverage perspective. I was having a conversation with Patty, I think yesterday or the day before, and I was probably drinking too much whiskey, which ironically my drink's empty, so I need to fill up again. But I was talking about how math exists even when we fucking hate it, right? And so you're in traffic, And everyone does this really complex and complicated math, and they don't even realize they do it. So you're in traffic, and you have two rows of people that are driving within these lines, right? And these lines are sort of guiding posts that allow you to sort of predict or understand movement. And so all they are is a way for you to understand the directionality of the lane next to you. And so when you've got two lanes that are going like this, they're going sort of parallel, and they've got a median line, what happens is this line will sometimes, whether they're checking their phone or whatever the fuck they're doing that causes them to drive like idiots, they start diverting towards the line. And the next person over actually will start to ebb and flow with them. Maybe it's less emphatic, or it's less expressed in that movement, but you've got this bow, and then you've got a smaller arc. Why do you do the smaller arc, right? So basically what you're doing is you're doing math, you're doing computation, and you're looking at the velocity of change. You're looking at how much they're coming at you and how fast they're going to predict where their line is going to intersect with yours. You're doing very, very fucking complex math, and you're doing it real time, and not even understanding that you're doing math. Like, you don't have to understand the premise of why you're doing that or what you're doing. It's just that this exists, and it exists because mathematics exists, and your brain is able to actually do that complex math without understanding that it's doing complex math. And so people who hate math, ironically, will have the same outcome or that same predicted maneuver away from somebody who's going to intersect with where their line is going. You will swerve in traffic because that dumbass just swerved at you, and it's innate, or it's something inherent to us as drivers, but it's also a very, very complex idea that's being expressed because your brain is literally doing the math for you and saying, that fucking guy's gonna hit you. If you don't move within a couple seconds, you're gonna fucking die. Maybe not die, I'm being dramatic, but basically it's saying, hey, these two lines are gonna intersect, and they're gonna intersect very soon. And so you use a heuristic, or you use a mental categorization that you created related to math and physics to understand, holy crap, no, Rebecca, it doesn't have anything to do with 420. I drink a lot, so my whiskey's empty, but I definitely do not smoke. I don't advocate for that behavior. But no, so you've got this mathematical premise that's happening, and we're doing it real time, and we're using heuristics, or this sort of learning mechanism that allows us to quickly categorize and react to the world around us. It's basically a fight or flight sort of mechanism that's happening here, where it's pre-conscious. It's before you actually like think to yourself, holy fuck, that person looks like they're coming over and they're going to hit me. Instead, you just react, and that reaction is like real time, nanosecond sort of reaction time, which is beautiful. Yeah, I've already used too many big words. This is funny. I like that I get to read this. But it's beautiful because you're understanding the mathematical premise that's happening of these intersecting lines without having to like think through it and be like, oh, well, what's the wind speed velocity of a, oh shit, I forget whatever the Monty Python thing is, where it's the wind speed velocity of a pharaoh, or not a pharaoh, a doggone sparrow, and is it the wind laden or the, I don't know, whatever. But so you're doing math, you're doing it real time, and you're doing it without actually thinking about it. So mathematics, as well as science, is this interesting premise where it happens independent of whether or not you recognize that it's happening, which is what I found sort of so fascinating. So the video that I posted was simply this guy expressing, without really understanding the mathematics or expressing the mathematics, that when you change the point of leverage within that lever, right? So when you go from a wheelbarrow, where your weight is actually internal to where your fulcrum is and where your leverage is applied, you're a third class lever. When you start moving it to the middle of the load, second class lever. And then if you push it way down here and your load is actually outside of both your fulcrum and your point of leverage, you're a first class lever. And then he takes and he changes the paradigm and moves away from levers entirely, lifts up the fulcrum such that the fulcrum is no longer in consideration. And now his load bearing is based on the strength of the body itself. So his core strength is actually like overriding the necessity of the lever. And so it was just it was fascinating. I figured it was quicker to talk instead of type, and then I wasted 10 minutes of y'all's time rambling about levers, math, and how it works. But this is surprisingly functional because there's actually a number of people who have looked and listened and engaged by the peanut gallery. And so thank you for that. I appreciate that. In addition, I was talking to my buddy at work. I'm gonna go right into telling you my secret plan to start like a podcast or a video thing. I was talking to my buddy at work, and politically, like, me and him are not really completely different ends of the spectrum, because you've got liberalism, you've got conservatism, and somehow I'm somewhere between moderate and fiscal conservative, and there's all kinds of layers of complexity there as well. But I was toying with the idea of, hey, what if we just started a podcast or video thing like this, where our whole premise was to take and tease and play with an idea. And so his first thing was, God, I'm going to spoil the whole first thing, even without having it. But his thing was, what if we talked about my position, and my position is the NRA is a terrorist organization. And I was like, beautiful. Yeah, let's just fucking play with that idea, right? And so I'm here, my friend, she thinks you're awesome. Awesome. I love it, right? So let's just talk through that idea, right? So NRA is a terroristic organization. First of all, I'm a member of the NRA, and so like my first reaction is, holy shit, you're attacking my views. It doesn't have to be that. It could be that. It doesn't have to be that. And so let's just play with that idea, right? NRA is a terroristic organization. Okay, so I'm hearing a couple things there and a couple trends, and I feel there's an emotional charge towards those pieces. And so let's play with the idea of terrorism. What is terrorism? Now, if you look at a rational definition, if you look at the definition, you can search it in your search engine now. It'll basically say something along the lines as using aggression or violence for a means of political gain. Okay, so it's fairly prescriptive, and I think that was actually written by either the World Health Organization or the UN or something like that. So it's an established definition, right? And so you look at the NRA and you say, okay, well, are they using violence and whatever for political gain? Do you actually believe that? And I would assume he says, yeah, of course. I'm making shit up for him. Apologies to him in advance. Okay, so give me examples. How do we play into this, right? Well, you could say that the NRA became politically activated or politically engaged after Parkland. That's a fair assumption, by the way. Every view that I express in this video is mine and mine alone. It does not reflect that of my employer. I think I'm supposed to say that. Anyway, so the NRA, right? Are they a political terrorist organization? So did they get activated after Parkland? Sure, absolutely they did. And so one could take and one could start to draw paradigms or parallels and say, okay, well, there's this heinous event of violence that happened, and now they're using that event of violence, not that they perpetuated or perpetrated, but instead that this event happened, and now they're using it for political gain, and thus they've used violence for political gain. That's a rational and reasonable discussion to have, right? It's not to say it's right or wrong. It's just to say, hey, that's a reasonable sort of assertion. Does it hold up to sort of standards of reason, or is it a reasonable assertion? Well, I could use that same paradigm of a violent action happened and a group took action for political gain, and I could say that the students of Parkland used a violent thing that happened for sort of this political protest thing. And so it's not to say that either is right or wrong. It's to say that if you use that lens and you apply it to the NRA and that specificity, then you could also use that same construct and apply it to the students of Parkland, David Hogg. Not right or wrong, just saying. You could also take and apply that to news organizations that took this heinous act that happened. They didn't do They didn't create it, but they reacted to it and used it as a conversation piece. And so functionally, they did the same thing. And so if you use that as the barometer for terrorism, then unfortunately it means that we're all equally guilty in that play. And so I don't think that that works as a construct to say, hey, NRA is a terroristic organization. Instead, I think what you could say about the NRA is they're very passionate. They very much have a viewpoint, and they very much act on that viewpoint. And whether you agree with it or not, you're just recognizing that people have an opinion, and because of that opinion, they're driven to follow through with or engage in a dialogue with the political landscape. And I think that that's totally acceptable. I don't think anyone would fault anyone for that. In fact, it's the premise of freedom and free speech, right? So I really thought that was an interesting construct. And looking at just the timer, I realized that I wasted 5 minutes talking about this thing that then could become a real good conversation. And so who knows, maybe the podcast will happen, and then we'll see if the podcast is a brilliant idea or a fucking stupid idea that Jamie thought up when he was drinking too much whiskey at God knows what, 9 o'clock in the evening. But I think that a lot of the constructs in society can be broken down with that same sort of analyses, right? It's not so much we drive to dogma of right and wrong, good and evil, and this sort of constraint. We create this paradigm where there's this side and that side, but there's so much room in between. There's so much interpretation and just understanding, right? If we engage it, there's a guy by the name of Dr. Jordan Peterson. He was at Harvard for a while. He got in some trouble and fired from Harvard, I think, because people felt offended by what he said, which is sort of the premise of free speech. And now I think he's on a sabbatical at University of Toronto. He's a fascinating gentleman. He's got a podcast, and I've been listening to it. It doesn't, like what he talks about, I don't have to agree or disagree. I just listen and then take that as a, hey, are there other questions that I should be or could be asking that I haven't been, right? Which is a very somewhat frightening and liberating idea in and of itself. And so he has this really, really great sort of visualization that he does, and I posted on this other thread, and so it's going to be repetitive for some people that were engaged in that conversation. But basically, he says the thing about Jesus Christ, and he's not advocating, he's not saying you have to be religious or anything. He's just sort of analyzing the Bible. He says the thing about Jesus. I'm atheist, and that's why I make that caution related to it. Right? It's not dogma. It's just an interpretation. And so he makes this visualization, and he talks about Jesus Christ, and he says Jesus Christ, right, had two options. There were sort of two options when we think about that duality or that dichotomy to life, right? There's good and bad, there's fight and flight. And so from an evolutionary standpoint, we're driven to one of those paradigms, right? You get into an unknown situation, and your body kicks in, your emotionality kicks in, the right hemisphere of your brain actually starts thinking about all the possibilities and very rapidly trying to find those heuristics and trying to find that way to interpret and take action on the world, similar to that driving thing we were talking about earlier. And so you often use heuristics to act very rapidly and make that decision in the moment such that you can preserve your life or the safety and well-being of those around you, right? You have to decide in nanoseconds something that can be very complex to consider. And so basically what he says is Jesus Christ had an option, right? So in the crucifixion of Christ, you talk about he could have fought the persecutors, he could have fought the people that were making him walk to his death, or he could have ran from the people that were making him walk to his death. And instead of doing either of those things, the sort of evolutionary or life-preserving things, the instincts, James, exactly, the instincts that you would have in that moment where your body's just like, we gotta go. Your heart picks up, your fucking mind stops doing logic and just goes to heuristics. It's just, what do I understand and how can I rapidly decide on a course of action to get me out of the situation, which is fight or flight. Instead of doing either of those things, he, as Jordan Peterson put it, he picked up his goddamn cross and he walked up the hill, right? And so the premise is like, you have sort of these natural tendencies and this inclination to drive at either of these two polar opposites, fighting or getting the fuck out of there, flight, right? But instead of doing either of those, he engaged in sort of that logical self and made the consideration or the decision to engage in that scenario. And thus, he picked up all of his burdens. He picked up the thing that was driving him to mortality, the cross. And now he walked up a goddamn hill. And so he's got the weight and the burden of this understanding and this knowledge and this realization that at the top of the hill, he's going to die. But instead of like fighting that outcome or running from that outcome, he engaged it, right? And so often we get into these conversations where we think there's a binary outcome of hey, I've either got to fight or I've got to run. And it's just patently false. And so what he's driven me to is this understanding that instead of running or fighting, we have an opportunity to engage, right? We can engage head on with something that disagrees with us, that we disagree with to the very core. And it shouldn't be, or it doesn't have to be a, you're wrong, I'm right. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game where you've got a winner and a loser. Instead, it could be a win-win scenario where both come out, as long as you understand sort of the underlying principles and the underlying premises of that conversation, right? And so now you talk about, well, NRA is a terroristic organization. I could choose the antithetical argument of, well, I think you're fucking crazy because I'm a member of the NRA and I can tell you that's false. That's not a very convincing argument. Instead, it actually drives that duality or that separation between the two views. It's actually like polarizing as opposed to accommodating to a perspective. Or you could sort of look outside of it and you can say, hey, what you're saying seems a little bit wild, possibly absurd to me. Let me see if I can understand what you're saying. And let's look at the underlying premises, because we might find at the bottom of it, there's something we can agree on. And if I think there's something that both sides can agree on, I think it's that Jamie needs another drink. I think that the underlying premise that you could agree on from both of those sides is that the NRA is a politically driven organization that tries to make political change. It seems reasonable, rational, and I don't think that either side can disagree with that. And so now you have commonality. Now you have a conversation. And if you have a conversation, holy shit, what can we solve in the world, right? And so when you talk about this duality, there's a lot of paradigms, a lot of parallels that you can draw, right? And so like there was this very, very interesting point that Dr. Jordan Peterson brought up, which I don't think he realized he brought it up when he brought it up. And that's basically this, that, God, I'm wandering a lot. Thanks. Ronnie's offering me to drink a double. I'm going to need that after this is done. If there's one very interesting premise that was brought up and not totally really like rationalized or discovered in this conversation, it was that Donald Trump is a god, right? Stay with me. Don't click on follow yet. So think about this for a second. When you think about Donald Trump and the presidency that he's had, right? There's this polarity, this binary system where you either like, oh my God, I believe everything he's done, or oh my God, everything he's done and everything that happens in government is a horrible thing. And so you're creating this system of good and evil where there's this weird balance and there's this weird argument. And of course, nobody's going to come to the middle ground from either of those sides because they've decided either I agree with what he does, and all that disagreements actually enforce my value system that says, oh, he must be doing well because I think that's absurd, or because I've believed in something he's done in the past. Or you wind up on the opposite end, which is to say everything that happens in government is because of Donald Trump, which is, it's kind of absurd and freaky and scary. And so if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, they'll tell you everything that happens in government is because Donald Trump did it and he's a horrible person. And they take the nuance of a fact and they say, oh, look at this, it happened, and so it was Donald Trump that did it, right? The other side is either one of two things, really. I hate to speak for all conservatives, but let me try and break it down to two constructs. One is he's doing great things, fucking hoorah, Donald Trump. Love that one. The second is like, great things are happening in government. Donald Trump is there while he's there, and that's cool. I don't think it's all because of him, and thus who fucking cares? Like, I don't got to be on either of these polar opposites, right? And then you have sort of that moderate in the middle that says, okay, let's just think about this. Let's just talk about this, right? And so, God, I wish I had a New York Times article from the last couple of days. I feel like they're plentiful in their hatred of Donald Trump. The one I argued about most recently was the New York Times and Washington Post were awarded Pulitzer Prizes for their political commentary related to the Russia. God, I don't even know what to fucking call it at this point. Russian integration in our electoral process, right? Cool. Let's fucking engage. Let's fucking engage and think through that, right? So we have this. Can we put you on TV? I don't know how that works. So we have this idea, right, that the Russians meddled with elections. That sounds fucking frightening, right? This other country is trying to adjust the political system of our country. I won't even get into sort of the history of how many times we've done that to foreign nations. It's not really relevant, but if you want to look it up, like we've supplanted the official governments of a number of countries over the last 50 to 100 years, and it's not really a surprise. Ignore that for a second. Just think about this idea that Russians meddled in the U.S. electoral system, okay? So what have we found so far? First of all, we've spent like hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to do this investigation into Russian meddling in the U.S. electoral process. I think that's fascinating. It's a brilliant discovery thing. Do I think it's worth $200 million? I'd probably tell you you're fucking crazy to believe that. Whatever. So what have we found with $200 million? We found that there were 16 people in Russia that spent about $1 million, and they created ads on Facebook. You can dive as deep as you want. Like when you extrapolate it up to what functionally happened, that's what functionally happened. And the other fascinating thing about those 16 people is they kind of rooted for both sides, which means they had either no fucking clue what they were doing, or they were very intentional in driving this disparity between the good and evil paradigm that we're talking about, right? And so rationally, do I care that there were 16 dudes in a Russian building somewhere close to Moscow that invested $1 million to drive people to craziness in the U.S. electoral process? I don't give a fuck. I don't. It's subjective. You can draw from that whatever you want. So that was one piece of the Russian investigation. The second piece was there was a couple of people on the electoral campaign of Donald Trump, right? And I forget the names. There's two guys, and the first guy was on Trump's campaign and was a campaign leader or manager or whatever for between 2 weeks and a month. That's objective fact. So he was involved in that electoral process. And the second guy, I think, actually had like 2 to 3 months. Okay. So those are facts. I concede those facts. And then you consider the extras that were drawn on top of that. So basically what happened was those two guys were involved in the Trump campaign, and they were found guilty of something completely irrelevant to the Trump campaign. They were basically lobbyists for Ukraine, right? And so they failed to register as lobbyists from Ukraine, and that's the charge that's held against them. And so they did something wrong. They broke the law, this law related to lobbyists, right? But it's for their affiliation with Ukraine. And then that affiliation or that lack of registry happened within 4 or 5, 7 years or whatever. And then they were involved in the campaign because they're associated with conservatives, and thus they had some affiliation to Trump. And then you have, well, Trump is under investigation for Russian meddling, and Ukraine and Russia actually had the sort of the political issue that was happening somewhat recently, where Russia may or may not have, who knows the actual facts, may or may not have helped facilitate sort of a militia takeover or a hostile takeover of parts of Ukraine. And so Russia is sort of, but not officially militarily associated with Ukraine, except for a part of Ukraine is now Russia. And then these two guys were associated with Ukraine, and then these two guys were associated with Trump, and Trump had this election that then somehow relates back to this involvement with Russian meddling, and thus, holy shit, the Mueller's investigation found something that incriminates him. Well, maybe, right? So you have this $1 million invested in Russia, these 16 guys that worked and spent that $1 million to associate and investigate or engage in political discourse for the U.S. And if you look at the results, like often the results are saying, hey, they did all this stuff for Trump. And then there's this extra little piece where they talked about liberalism and they advocated for Hillary Clinton. Oh, so basically they were the fucking hot mess and they advocated for everyone, and everyone's probably guilty, incriminated, or impugned in character or whatever. And so you've got $1 million in Russia. You've got these two guys that are somehow sort of related to Russia. Not really. And we're only sort of related to Donald Trump. And everyone's like, holy shit, we found it. This is the Russian link. We've justified this $200 million we've spent on this investigation into the Russian conspiratorial election fraud of 2016. Yay, us. And it's like, well, you're kind of grasping at straws now. If it were my money, and hopefully it should be because this is our government, I would probably say, you might be wasting my fucking time and money. That's just my perspective, right? And so now we've come from this idea of, can this thing exist? Like, was Russia meddling, to holy shit, Donald Trump's so corrupt and he's so bad, and thus we can express or explain this stratification and this differentiation between our viewpoints, because on the left, oh my God, that man's complete and total evil. Anything that happens in the government is complete and total evil. And on the right, you're like, one of the two decisions, right? The alt-right or the far right would say, holy shit, everything he does is fucking beautiful, wonderful, etc. It's that God paradigm, right? It's that you can do no wrong or can do no right. And that's the duality, right? That's the dichotomy that's driving people apart. For me, what I look at is I say, sometimes he says some dumb shit. Sometimes he says some shit I agree with. Guess what? That's like everybody I've ever met in my fucking life. So good job for him, because people fuck up, people make mistakes, people say dumb shit. But the reality is that he doesn't control everything that happens in the government. Imagine if he was the person, if he was literally responsible for every decision that was made in the Department of Education, every decision that was made in the Department of Justice, every decision that was made at Trump Tower in New York, every decision that was made with Mar-a-Lago. He doesn't, I don't know how you fucking scale at that point, right? Like, I don't know how that's even feasible. I know I can't do like 1/1000th of that shit. I just don't have the capacity to interact with that many different conversations at a given time. And so while I think it's a beautiful sort of thing to drive us apart, like if you conceptualize that he's responsible for everything, but that's also sort of saying that he's a god, can be everywhere, and he's omniscient and omnipotent and so on. And so it's not really rational at that point. It's not really functional. It just, yes, James, you're fucking doing push-ups wrong. You need to fix those push-ups. Change the leverage and go from a third class to a second class to a non-lever. And so that's I think the premise of the conversation I wanted to have. Sort of, I guess there were a couple parts. One is leverage and math are somewhat ubiquitous, and thus we should either learn them or cognitively decide, hey, fuck it, I don't like math, it's too complex and I don't want to deal in that space, which is completely fine, because I always tell people I fucking hate math. Yay, us. The second premise, I don't even remember what it was. Sort of that conversation we can have where there's not this duality, there's not this dichotomy of outcome. Instead, there's sort of this ambiguity in between. And then I guess the that third piece was that that Trump probably isn't a god. He's probably just a man, and so we might give him far too much credit, and we might be spending far too much money to look into whether or not he's a god. And I'm going to go out on a limb and tell you he's not for either side. It's sort of this compromise we need to come to. Woke as fuck. Greg, we need to get that beer soon. I ran out of whiskey, and so I'm a little bit let down. I think that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching and putting up with my bullshit. I realized I rambled for 35 minutes, which generally I don't try and talk that much, but I think it was a good conversation. Thank you all so much, and yeah, if I start that podcast up, I'll let you guys know. Thanks.